Undisclosed location, German Republic, 2007. The Americans are distracted. Now would be a prudent time to strike. The statement elicited a round of murmurs from the men gathered around the long conference table. None wore uniforms, insignia, or any mark of station. As a show of solidarity, it had become the group's tradition to strip themselves of any sign of status or political power at each meeting. But all knew the political worth of their peers, and some members of this meeting would have been recognizable to any member of the public. The defense minister, for example, or the secretary of labor. Other faces were less well known. Senior intelligence officials, titans of industry who did their best to remain out of the limelight, wealthy aristocrats whose families still wielded significant political power. To some, this was a meeting of traitors. To others, patriots of the highest order. The defense minister shook his head gravely. They still wield considerable conventional power despite their commitments to Venezuela and Afghanistan, and any hostilities with America will trigger an Article 5 response from SEATO. The Americans and many in the Saudi elite had hoped that decades of cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia would have acclimated the worst of the fundamentalists to the presence of U.S. troops in the Holy Land. They were there by invitation, a shield to further German expansion in the Middle East. But the fundamentalists painted all the Westerners with the same brush and saw little difference between Germany's occupation of Palestine, Jordan, and more, and the American presence in Saudi Arabia. They blamed the Americans for the liberal values that had taken root in the once fundamentalist nation, a cancer on Muslim purity. They had made their voices known on September 11, 2001, when 2 aircraft struck the World Trade Center in New York. Another hit the Pentagon, but the 4th had been brought down by the passengers who'd heroically sacrificed themselves to avoid further tragedy. The American response had been surprising, not just to the terror network that had launched the attack from the safety of a fundamentalist-controlled Afghanistan, but to the Germans. Within 2 months, the U.S. had put boots on the ground. In less than a month, the same fundamentalist regime the Germans had financially backed in the 70s to overthrow the liberal American-backed one had been driven from power. But now an insurgency raged in no small part due to Germany seizing the opportunity to funnel hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks in equipment and supplies to the ousted regime. It had diverted resources from the still raging insurgency in Venezuela, which also kept the Americans tied up, but the investment was worth it. The real problem was challenging America conventionally as long as it had the full backing of its Southeast Asia Treaty Organization allies, China, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and more. Then we must work to weaken SEATO from within. What we need is another Johnson. The man who spoke this time was a steel tycoon. His company oversaw 44% of the Reich steel production, with labor camps set up across the former Soviet Union, pumping out some of the finest quality steel in the entire world. A senior German intelligence official shook his head vehemently. American politics may be open to anyone with the resources to influence them, but the Johnson affair blew up in our faces thanks to those medical research leaks. The leaking of photos and videos from the Reich's advanced medical research laboratories had resulted in massive social and political backlash against the Reich. Well known to be a xenophobic state, the world largely turned a blind eye to the way it treated people in occupied territories. It had even gladly kept the open secret about the Reich's cultural advancement programs, which were little more than forced labor camps or extermination camps for those deemed not strong enough to work. But having photo and video evidence shoved into its face over TV broadcasts had forced the world to finally act. Germany was never more isolated internationally, and this was but one of many of its problems. The intelligence official shook his head again. No, the Americans are too anti-German to fall for another Johnson so soon. Anything we do will just polarize them even further against us. What we must actually do is look inwardly, not outwardly. The table grew silent. Some knew what he was about to say. And even here, in a meeting that were it to be discovered, most if not all the men who were here would be imprisoned or worse. They were dangerous words. For decades, our foolish pursuit of racial purity has done nothing but drive birth rates down, wiped out entire labor pools, and driven the best and brightest straight into the arms of the Americans. For all the talk of their mongrel society, they have outdone us in nearly every area of competition. Our stupid insistence on ignoring their accomplishments has placed the Reich in the gravest danger it has ever been. The Americans don't need to fire a single shot to destroy us. They need only wait and continue to overtake us in scientific achievement, economy, even culture. It is the purity of our people that has united Europe, creating the greatest power the continent has ever known. The Secretary of Labor banged his fist against the table angrily. And while you were taking Europe, the Americans took the world. The intelligence official's remark stunned the assembled group. Even as deeply indoctrinated as they were, it was a difficult point to contest. Birth rates were down, at their lowest point in the Reich's history, and social advancement programs had failed to yield the hundreds of millions of pure-blooded Aryan citizens the Reich desperately needed to continue competing with America and its allies. The English and French-occupied territories had been even granted a degree of anonymity. Germany simply couldn't shoulder the cost of continuing to administer the entirety of the Reich on its own any longer. If the assembled men had paid more attention to history, they would have seen the writing on the wall. If they had better resisted the years of propaganda indoctrination that they'd all grown up with, they may have listened to the intelligence official. Instead, the only group with the collective political, economic, and military capital to challenge the Chancellor and change Germany's direction would not, and the intelligence official would be dead within the week. Zabaykalsk, occupied Soviet territory. The traffic at the border control point was more intense than usual. Finding itself unable to fully exploit the natural resources of the former Soviet territories on its own, the Reich had at last opened up investment to foreign powers. Given that this was about as far east as one could go in the Soviet territories and thousands of kilometers from Berlin, the move to allow foreign investment hadn't been nearly as controversial. But for Obergefreiter Hans Bauer, that meant pulling border duty and inspecting the vehicles of thousands of Chinese and other mongrel races, most of which worked at the newly opened oil fields and mines, or simply delivered critically needed supplies. The Reich was experiencing a manpower crisis, too much territory, too few people, and was increasingly at risk of losing its grip on its post-World War II holdings. But that didn't mean Hans had to like what was happening one single bit. He snarled out a guttural stop when the next driver pulling up to his checkpoint failed to stop exactly at the red paint markings indicating where the front wheels should rest. He'd been taught some basic Chinese, despite the fact that the people coming through this checkpoint were as much Chinese as not, but he refused to use it. If these dogs wanted to profit off the Reich, then they better learn German. The driver was clearly not Chinese, or at least not full-blooded. There were hints of Arab by the look of it, but who could tell with all the race mixing that went on in those uncivilized parts of the world? The only thing he'd been taught about Arabs was to never let one touch you. They wiped themselves with their hands, he'd been told. Disgusting. But what was to be expected? Hans barked out a command for the driver's documents. The driver appeared nervous, but Hans was impatient and frankly too bored to pay much attention. He never noticed the small snub-nosed pistol that appeared in the open windshield and put a 9mm round straight through his brain. In the passenger seat, the man accompanying the driver brandished an M16 and opened fire on the other guard assisting with the inspection. The American-made rifles were widely available thanks to decades of having been provided by the US government to guerrilla fighters across Asia and Africa combating the Reich. It had quickly become a symbol of anti-Reich resistance, and it was an effective one, reliable and accurate. What it lacked in stopping power, it made up for in ruggedness and precision. The 5.56 rounds with steel penetrator cores punched straight through the soldier's body armor, and seconds later the driver was gunning the engine as hard as he could. The truck lurched forward and ran over the spike strips that would normally be removed by the soldiers shortly before the truck was allowed entry. The metal of the wheels screamed as the vehicle ran on rims, but it didn't need to go much further. Just a quarter of a kilometer ahead, the traffic had come to a logjam again as the intake lanes narrowed to a regular highway. Other border guards opened fire on the runaway vehicle, strafing it with rifle and machine gun fire, but they couldn't stop 3 tons of runaway truck, and shortly before the wheels completely disintegrated, the vehicle smashed straight into the back of a van waiting at the rear end of the traffic logjam. A moment later, the several thousand pounds of explosives in the back of the truck exploded, but not before atomizing 200 pounds of low-grade uranium. The explosion created a 10-meter crater, destroyed 3 dozen vehicles, and killed 45 people, 5 of them being German. But the molecular uranium was spread over hundreds of meters, irradiating the entire border checkpoint and much of the land around it. Even with months of cleanup efforts, the site would remain unusable for years, effectively choking off a vital trade artery into the Soviet territories. Simultaneous attacks across the Chinese-German border contaminated other major trade arteries. The badly needed trade corridors would end up shuttering many operations in the Russian Far East, causing significant economic harm to the Reich and spoiling its opportunity to exploit its lucrative gas, petroleum, and mineral deposits that marked the territory. Hong Kong, China. Sun Ning waited patiently for the German ambassador, ordering a second appetizer. She'd already finished the first 15 minutes ago and had arrived famished. She hadn't had much of a chance to eat due to the hectic nature of her work in the wake of the border terrorist attacks. The ambassador was either having similar issues, and she had no reason to doubt he wasn't, or his tardiness was to make a point. Selma Krause finally arrived, escorted by waitstaff to the private dining table toward the rear of the restaurant. The two women cordially greeted each other, Sun making a mental note of the way the ambassador had defaulted to German. Normally, it was common courtesy to utilize the tongue of the nation a diplomat was being hosted in. Like so many other things in the grand game of international diplomacy, this small detail was neither an accident nor insignificant. At least it gave Sun a portent of how this conversation may go. "I hope this evening finds you well, Miss Ning. I apologize for my tardiness." Krause hadn't offered a reason for her lateness, another neither accidental nor insignificant detail. "Not at all, Miss Krause. It afforded me a brief calm amidst my chaotic day." The two women smiled politely at each other. The diplomatic sparring had already begun. But the act was one of habit by both attendees, because this dinner, like so many others before it, was not about traditional diplomacy. The women, both powerful representatives of their respective governments, had found it convenient long ago to hold informal discussions where they could speak more freely with one another. It had been a mutually beneficial arrangement that had likely averted numerous international misunderstandings between the German superpower and a China that was increasingly finding its own footing on the international stage. A waiter arrived and took the women's orders, then retreated. The table was far enough away from the common dining area that the ambient noise and the restaurant's music effectively drowned out their conversation. Krause didn't believe for a moment that the Chinese hadn't planted multiple bugs on the table and in the vicinity, but what she discussed here was never secret. "Your government has made a grave mistake, one whose consequences it may soon discover is ill-prepared to bear." Sun was unfazed. She was a woman in a senior leadership position in a Chinese nation deeply rooted in Han chauvinism. It would take more than threats of war to get a rise out of her. "I believe it is you who's made the mistake. We know that you have analyzed the uranium debris and that the isotope ratio indicates it comes from the Congo." Krause did flinch ever so slightly. How the Chinese, an inferior race, had managed to penetrate so deeply into German intelligence was a matter of national concern. Only Reich citizens could serve in the German military, government, or intelligence apparatus, so a Chinese plant was practically impossible. Perhaps their ability to eavesdrop electronically was significantly more advanced than they had suspected, however. Or perhaps the Americans were lending their aid. Since evicting the communists to Taiwan after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and the Democratic Government of China had been close allies. Both thoughts were equally alarming. "The attacks were launched from your territory. My superiors are finding it increasingly difficult to believe the Chinese government was in no way involved." The Americans were equally incredulous that a group operating out of the caves in Afghanistan could bring down the World Trade Center and seriously damage the Pentagon. Hijacking and crashing a couple of airplanes into a building is one thing. Transporting hundreds of kilos of even low-grade uranium across China is another altogether. And as I said, my superiors are finding it increasingly difficult to believe you were not involved in any way. The two paused their conversation long before the waiter bringing their drinks was within earshot, an old habit of career diplomats. Only once the ambience drowned out their words once more did they resume their verbal sparring match. "You would do well, Mrs. Krause, to remind your superiors that the Himalayas stand tall, and moving troops into the Russian Far East is expensive and risky. China is not impressed by military threats against it. In case you've forgotten, CETO is treaty-bound to respond to any military attack against it." Krause took a long drink of her sparkling water before responding. She never drank wine, not even at home. The American-made bugs the Chinese agents had planted there confirmed it. "I wouldn't underestimate the Wehrmacht, Miss Ning. I would also not be so confident about the American people's willingness to defend China thousands of miles from their own shores." Sun sipped her own drink. The Himalayas were an effective barrier between China and the German Indian Territory. It was still largely administered by the British, who enjoyed a small amount of autonomy within the Reich. But unlike in other territories, the Germans hadn't enacted their cultural enhancement programs. Perhaps it was too far from their own home, or perhaps it was simply too difficult to murder 1 billion people quietly. Either way, rather than extermination or enslavement, the Indians had actually been left much in the same state as when they were ruled by colonial Britain. Even so, Nazi Germany had more than enough Indian troops in the uniform of the Reich to pose a serious challenge to China, if the Himalayas could be overcome, or if America simply stayed home. And that point did scare Sun, because despite their treaty commitments, the Americans had a strong isolationist streak in them. It had been their isolationism that allowed Britain to fall, entering the European theater far too late to stop the complete occupation of Europe by the Reich. They had only opted to enter the European War at all when it became clear the Nazis were on the verge of taking the entirety of the Middle East. and thus gaining a stranglehold on global oil exports. With the two increasingly unpopular wars quickly turning into asymmetric quagmires and deeply polarized politics, the American commitment to Article 5 was increasingly in question. University of Michigan. The American people need to seriously ask themselves, how much and how many? Parts of the crowd murmured its approval. The rest remained silent. It was a far cry from the fiery rallies of President Johnson in the late 80s and early 90s, but since news of the Nazi medical experimentation on Jews, the mentally challenged and other undesirables had broken, the American people had cooled significantly on anyone seen as pro-Reich. The America United movement had faltered considerably, but it hadn't gone extinct. Johnson's failure to secure a second term, combined with allegations of collaboration with the Nazis, which remained unproven, had been a death knell for the movement. But like a slumbering beast, it hadn't truly died, simply gone into hibernation until enough time had passed for the collective consciousness to forget. Americans were, after all, the most emotional of all democracies, and emotions, when properly stoked, could burn hotter than any rational thought. The speaker, young, handsome, probably only a few years out of college, was in the final closing remarks of the small rally. He was charismatic, impassioned, and despite the lukewarm reaction of the crowd, more were clapping now than when he had begun speaking. The United States spends billions on bases overseas, shoring up weak allies who are not pulling their fair share. And all this at a time when it's involved in 2 wars. America's at the breaking point, friends. She cannot take much more of this. Let China, Japan, Australia, let CETO stand on its own, without us having to babysit it, without these countries exploiting us. They're not paying their fair share, and we all know it. Now they want us to fight their wars for them too. More of the crowd began to nod and clap in approval. Friends, we need to be a country of peace, not war, especially not one that wages other people's wars. People who don't even contribute their fair share to this alliance. We need to send a message to Washington, to the entire establishment. We're not writing checks for the rest of the world anymore. We need to take care of our veterans, our retirees, our own people in infrastructure are all falling apart because Washington sends all your tax dollars overseas. America needs to stand united, and it needs to place America first. There was a small outburst of applause, not the thunderous roar that Johnson's rallies once elicited, but a small, promising start nonetheless. Afghanistan. Son, can you explain to me why in Sam Dick I'm still taking fire from that building? Lieutenant Colonel Tomlin leaned down next to the corporal taking cover behind the brick wall so he could better be heard over the raging firefight. The small city in East Afghanistan had been cleared of enemy fighters for years, but a massive influx of German-made arms had made its way to the northern Pakistani tribal areas, where the beaten insurgency had been licking its wounds. The insurgency, near the brink of collapse, had been rejuvenated with a vigor that took the U.S. by surprise. Now it was having to retake old territory against an enemy armed with frighteningly modern weapons. The young corporal winced every time rounds cracked the stone nearby. For Tomlin, they were just another annoyance, but not as great as the fact that he shouldn't have been taking any fire, because the enemy's base, a 3-story house, should have been either cleared or leveled by now. At this point, Tomlin would have settled for leveled. The lieutenant colonel pointed at the rocket launcher on the soldier's back. You've got an Army-issue M141 bunker-defeat munition strapped to your back, boy. Why in a bald eagle's nutsack have you not employed the weapon the American taxpayer has been gracious enough to equip you with? The corporal winced again as more rounds cracked the thick concrete cinder blocks that he and his squad were taking cover behind. The lieutenant colonel seemed oblivious to the incoming fire, only hunching down behind the cover so he could be heard over the racket. Sir, we've witnessed several possible civilians in that building. Corporal, every civilian death is a goddamn tragedy and a stain on those whose profession is the honorable pursuit of warfare. But how much longer you reckon this brick wall is going to hold under fire? Not long was the proper answer, evidenced by the slowly disintegrating bricks they were taking cover behind. The corporal thought for a moment, then nodded. Turning to his squad, he flipped the rocket off his back. I'm popping that house, give me cover! The squad saw gunner lifted his weapon up over the concrete parapet and began to open up on the building, providing cover fire alongside several other riflemen. The corporal quickly prepared the rocket, then picked himself up onto a knee and brought the weapon to bear. The lieutenant colonel, now standing fully up and watching the building expectantly, looked down to offer a final piece of instruction. Don't forget to check your back blast, son. With a significant pop and a hiss, the rocket ejected from the barrel and began to roar toward its target. Tomlin shoved the soldier's head down behind cover as he remained standing and watched the target's house. Head down, boy! You don't want to get it knocked off by debris. At only about 100 or so meters away, the flash and the roar of the explosion were simultaneous. The M141 was designed to take out fortified enemy bunkers. The 3-story civilian house didn't stand a chance. Anyone who survived the initial explosion, an unlikely proposition, was buried under tons of rubble. The fight over this stretch of 4 blocks died down soon after. The job of clearing the neighborhood was a dirty one, door-to-door fighting in close quarters. But Tomlin's men were well trained and all extremely experienced after 6 years of fighting. He should have been a colonel by now, but Tomlin had refused to test for promotion. His rank already demanded too much non-combat time from him. If he got the big birds on his shoulders, he'd likely get pulled out of it completely. That was unacceptable. The Army had threatened to retire him if he continued to decline testing, and Tomlin had immediately offered his resignation. His superiors had quickly retracted that threat. As the sun began to set, he came across the same corporal poking through the remains of the building he'd been responsible for demolishing. The young man noticed Tomlin and acknowledged him with a grim nod. "Colonel, they found bodies, civilians in the rubble, 3 of them." Tomlin sighed, removing his helmet for the first time since the fighting had started that morning. He was soaked in sweat, and salt had crusted along the nape of his neck, irritating his skin and wearing it raw as his body armor shifted with every step he took. "Corporal, one day when you get back home, you'll hear the bleeding hearts going on and on about civilian casualties. But you didn't come here to kill civilians, and those civilians didn't choose this either. The enemy made that choice for them, and sure, maybe you could have taken the building without losing any of your squad, or maybe it would have taken 1 or 2 of you to get here. Not a bad exchange for 3 civilians, if we're being honest, but maybe it would have taken your entire squad." Tomlin placed his helmet down on the ground and sat on it, undoing his bootlaces so his feet could breathe a little. "Point is, you don't know how many of your buddies' lives it would have taken. So you made the choice you did. And those bleeding hearts back home? They weren't here to make that choice either." Lieutenant Colonel Tomlin squinted up at the setting sun, the sounds of battle having moved significantly ahead of his position. It wasn't so much that he liked being in combat. It was that this was where he was needed the most. Now go check out What If Hitler Won World War II 1950s, or click this other video instead.